It's the first Monarch on the air, and it's the earliest BBC recording. Before we meet the King, previously on the British Broadcasting Century. Our main podcast timeline has reached May 1923, with the BBC in its new home at Savoy Hill, launched with Men's Hour, then Women's Hour. For this episode, we leap ahead 1 year later to April 1924. Oh, we'll return to 1923 soon enough. But for one special episode, we're whizzing past simultaneous broadcasting, Shakespeare and sport, radio times and relay stations, pips, the shipping forecast, and much, much more. We'll get to all that. But exactly 100 years ago from the week of this episode's release, it's the 23rd of April 1924, and a landmark broadcast. The centenary of, as they say in Hamilton, a message from the King.
To come here today with the Queen.
The Monarch came on the air first at the opening of a Wembley exhibition.
I remember Wembley exhibition. King stands here, microphone stands there.
George V on the BBC 100 years ago right now. It's one heck of a tale. We'll bring you some of the recording, the story of how it was broadcast, and how it fits into the history of royal broadcasts and radio recordings. Please be upstanding or sit downing. You be as comfy as you like. It's the first Monarch and the earliest BBC recording on the British Broadcasting Century.
Hello, this is Paul Carenza calling.
This is London Calling.
Hello. Welcome to the podcast that relives, recreates, and really gets stuck down rabbit holes of the forgotten landmarks of British broadcasting. This is not made by the BBC, but made by a sitcom writer, comedian, radio presenter, and I'm now calling myself radio historian. Stick that on your LinkedIn profile. I'm Paul Carenza, leaping ahead this episode, actually for the next couple of episodes of the podcast, to 1924, because 100 years ago, right now, the biggest thing we had yet done, said Reith, an event all about making the nation as one man.
I declare the British Empire exhibition open.
Downton Abbey featured it when they all gather around their first wireless set. The first Monarch on the radio is the moment that Hugh Bonneville's Lord Grantham and his fictitious house staff gather round their new valve set. And as well as those fictitious people, an estimated 10 million real people heard it, making it by far radio's biggest audience to date. Reith thought that maybe 1 million might hear it, but he didn't count on the shops and the street corners amplifying it. Towns across the land were ringing with the BBC broadcast. There had been just a handful of royals on the air before, and I'll run down some of those later this episode for you. Not a Newsnight interview among these broadcast royals. So this broadcast on St George's Day 1924 is important twice over. It's not just the first Monarch, but it's the earliest recording we have of a BBC broadcast, and it sounded like this.
Here today with the Queen for the purpose of opening the British Empire exhibition.
The quality, of course, is not great. That's partly due to outside echo. They're not at a studio, they're essentially at Wembley Stadium. And partly, of course, it's due to the technical kit of the day. This is the 1920s. In fact, this is almost the only time you will ever hear the 1920s. The BBC had no means to record anything until 1932, when they got a Blattnerphone. So how come there was this 1924 recording and then a gap for 8 years? All will be revealed this episode, thanks to a Croydon porch, a producer who loved his history, and a 1964 episode of Desert Island Discs. Also this episode, a lion, a BBC engineer undermining palace etiquette, and George V's parents encounter radio earlier than you might think. So I had a dilemma this episode. Given it's about two great firsts, do I lead off on the momentous moment of the earliest BBC recording? Or do we lead off about the first Monarch on radio? But to know where to start, I actually asked you lot on Facebook and Twitter. Do find us there. 78% of you thought the earliest recording factor was the most important attribute. So we'll begin with that. How this has somehow been recorded and stayed in the archives, while everything else from the 20s hasn't. Firstly, though, we should really tell you about the broadcast itself and the occasion itself.
Chapter 1. The event.
John Reith, then managing director of the British Broadcasting Company, had been asking the King on the air for months. A year before, he tried to broadcast the wedding of the future George VI to Elizabeth, the future Queen Mother. The royals had been up for it, but the Dean of Westminster turned his nose up at radio, saying pub-goers might listen with their hats on. Trouble with radio, you can't tell if listeners are listening with decorum and dignity. I hope that you, dear podcast listener, are standing to attention for this entire podcast's duration. If any of you are daring to listen in the bath, oh gosh, the authorities would shudder.
The Monarch came on the air first at the opening of a Wembley exhibition. Lots of us were anxious to get the King to speak to his people through this medium.
So John Reith wanted a Christmas or a New Year broadcast at the close of 1923. He even presented the palace with a wireless set to try and convince the King, but to no avail. George V will be given another radio set as part of this 1924 broadcast. It seems that Reith just kept sending the King radio sets till he agreed to something, maybe in the hope that Reith would stop sending him radio sets. For the palace, the concern was that the King's voice would cross the threshold into people's homes. It could be too informal. Surely some distance was better for the monarchy. Broadcasting, after all, was the annihilation of space. A great leveller. All voices equal. Doesn't sound too good for the monarchy, does it? But Reith knew that broadcasting would be ideal to amplify state occasions. It could really help the BBC out. And Reith thought it could also help those other institutions like the royal family. And this Empire exhibition had been planned for years. It was certainly going to be a great state occasion. Its whole raison d'etre was to promote Britain, and how better to promote than with radio. After much convincing then, the palace agreed. "The biggest thing in wireless history, so far as the British Isles are concerned," said the Hull Daily Mail on the 21st of April 1924. "Hundreds of thousands, actually millions, will, through the broadcasting of the speech, be enabled to hear His Majesty's voice for the first time. The King will be brought into a closer contact with hundreds of thousands, millions, of his subjects at one time, a thing undreamed of a few years ago." Yeah, so just imagine, if you will, seeing our King today, King Charles, for decades in the newspapers, but imagine you'd never heard his voice. Spitting image would make no sense whatsoever. Now, actually, there had been a chance to hear George V's voice 1 year earlier in 1923. For Empire Day, the King and his wife, Queen Mary, had actually released a record.
On this day, my people in all parts of the world join to celebrate their unity and to draw closer to common ties which hold them together.
Not half palace pot pickers. For this occasion, they spoke at Buckingham Palace into HMV microphones. This disc is, the only recording as well of Queen Mary's voice.
On this day of memory and hope, it is also the birthday of good Queen Victoria. It is my message to you, the daughters of our worldwide family of nations and peoples. Think always of what you can do to make your homes happy, and how you can best prepare yourselves to make happy homes for the generations of children which will follow you.
But 1 year later, it's 1924, and forget Empire Day, we have this Empire exhibition. This was a chance to unite the empire. So top brass thought, really it's a chance to market Britain to a dwindling empire. By 1924, the empire is the beginning of the end, put it that way. Britain was going to leave India, just hadn't yet. It needed something to remind the rest of the British Empire that, stick with us. Yeah, Commonwealth's got a ring to it, hasn't it? So at this exhibition, they had pavilions and put up tents and cultural areas reflecting countries of the empire. In the Canadian area, they had a life-size model of the future Edward VIII, Prince of Wales, made out of butter. Yeah, entirely sculpted face as well. Worth a Google image search if you'd like to see Edward VIII made entirely out of butter at this exhibition. The only prince you can spread on your toast. There's some trivia for you. George V was not a fan of broadcasting. His son loved it, both to listen to and to broadcast. But yeah, Georgie V, Grandpa England as he was known, on the throne from 1910 to 1936, he shirked at the sight of a microphone. And Wembley's Empire exhibition, well, they had to put the microphone somewhere. So in the setup to it, there was a great discussion between the BBC engineers and the palace aides as to where and how the microphone staging should be.
I remember Wembley exhibition covered in red paint.
Chief Engineer Peter Eckersley certainly enjoyed telling that tale.
There was a question of the King's broadcast, where he should stand and where the microphone should be. Yeah. And there were terribly important people all round the place deciding where the microphone should be, where King George should stand, and all the rest of it. And in the midst of this debate, very, very suavely conducted in an extremely gentlemanly manner, with no decision, as is usual with a gentlemanly manner, up suddenly, like some demon appearing at the pantomime, through a trapdoor in the stage appeared a workman. And he walked up to us all and he said, "King stands here, microphone stands there," and started boring a hole, just like that. Decision was taken, and of course it just shows that meetings are no good. Decision is essential.
Ah, the honest, flat-capped BBC engineer cutting through royal etiquette. Peter Eckersley's brother Roger had by now joined the BBC. He would work his way up very quickly to one of the top jobs overseeing programmes. But one of Roger Eckersley's first jobs at the BBC was on this regal occasion, working with a different king, not George V, but the King of the Jungle. Yes, they wanted a lion to roar on cue and help King George V open the Empire exhibition. So Roger Eckersley was tasked with finding a lion and a lion tamer. The roar would then open the event. Roger had experience of working with animals. As a pre-BBC, he tried and failed to run a chicken farm. So while Roger looked for a lion and brother Peter oversaw the engineering, the press did their part, putting aside any vendetta with the broadcaster. The newspapers didn't just trail this wonderful event and magical broadcast. They actually helped set up amplification all across the country. 2 weeks before the big broadcast, 5th of April 1924, the Daily Chronicle gave readers a list of 200 towns where they themselves had placed General Electric loudspeakers. Altrincham, Alton, Aberdeen, Aberystwyth, Alford, those are just the A's. The Daily Chronicle is the first newspaper to organise a scheme under which a royal message could be heard not only by those with listening insets, but by the general public. Yeah, PA systems, where you live. The Daily Mail and other newspapers joined in too, wiring up streets in Leeds, Manchester, Glasgow, picture houses, newspaper offices, town halls, buildings at the docks. All of them would radiate the King's broadcast. The BBC, meanwhile, was behind the scenes prepping and testing everything to ensure the King's voice would travel well. The broadcasting of the opening of the British Empire exhibition presents some interesting but difficult features. From the Radio Times in April 1924. There are 3 main events to be transmitted. A, the speeches by His Majesty the King and the Prince of Wales. B, massed bands marching and counter-marching in the stadium. C, the choir singing. The stadium is no small studio in which to concentrate your effects. You have no opportunity of rehearsing your effects, and if you had, it is unlikely that you would have much say in arranging things. There'll be 3 microphones for broadcasting the events, A, B and C, as indicated above. The wires will meet at a central point, and there come together under the control of a Superman. Yes, perhaps this is the first mention of Superman in the Radio Times, but here referring to a BBC engineer in a kiosk. Anyway, we need to get to the big event itself. The night before, listeners could hear engineers' tests from Wembley saying things like, "Now, I'm right under it. How's that? I'm moving away and going on speaking. How's it coming through? All right?" No off-air testing was possible here. Also, while listeners were normally told off for sharing their radio sets with neighbours, on this occasion, Tualo was heard to announce, "In view of the interest taken in the transmission of the King's speech on the occasion of the opening of the British Empire exhibition tomorrow, Wednesday, we're authorised to say that the Postmaster General will on that occasion raise no objection to the holder of a wireless licence transferring his apparatus temporarily to other premises for the purpose of giving a public or private demonstration of wireless reception. It will not be necessary, therefore, to apply for a special permit." Enjoy the broadcast, Britain, wherever you wish.
Chapter 2. The Broadcast.
The next morning, then, the opening of the exhibition. John Reith's car collected him at 9. His wife went, his mum too, who excitedly told people that she remembered the 1871 exhibition. The ceremony itself was scheduled for 10:30 to 12:15, all broadcast. The King's speech at 11:30. Before that, at 10:23, if you had your radio set on, you would hear the tuning note until 10:30, just to tell you that you're on the right frequency. At 10:30 you would hear London 2:00. We are going to switch over to the stadium. Live music then commenced as the massed bands paraded into the stadium, cheered by the vast crowd as they arrived. Just before 11 a.m, the choir sang an anthem by Elgar, who is in charge of the music today. Yes, Elgar, not a historical person yet, just a bloke with a few good tunes and a baton. And then at 11:24, the Prince of Wales arrives at the ceremony, and for listeners, the sharp words of command to the Guard of Honour rang out clearly. One could hear the click of the men's heels as they came to attention, says the Hull Daily Mail. At 11:30, fanfare for the King and Queen. Cheering crowds, the national anthem by the massed bands. And some listeners report that, yes, they stand by their wireless sets until God Save the King had finished. And then the Prince of Wales spoke.
During the last stages of preparation, there have been many adverse factors, not the least of which was a very inclement winter.
As clear and distinct in every syllable as a gifted actor, said a listener. Nothing of the university drawl in his utterance, but every word clear, the style utterly unaffected.
You see before you a complete and a vivid representation of all your empire.
The Prince is, of course, future Edward VIII, and he will abdicate via radio one day. But here he introduces the exhibition and then his father. 14 years into his 26-year reign, the first monarch in the world to broadcast. George V.
To come here today with the Queen for the purpose of opening the British Empire exhibition.
And the country stops to listen.
Our heartiest congratulations.
Traffic stops on Oxford Street, listening to the loudspeakers. Similar scenes across the country. Who knows how people responded when they heard the lion roar, seemingly in the distance of their local high street. They must have been petrified.
For the marvellous organisation and industry.
Edinburgh's bandstand on Princes Street Gardens had Marconi loudspeakers installed because the Edinburgh radio station was delayed in opening, unfortunately. So all who care to visit the gardens on the afternoon may listen to the King's remarks.
Adverse circumstances, including the exceptionally unfavourable weather.
Other parts of the country paused to listen as well. Court proceedings stopped. A government inquiry came to a halt. The nation paused for this kingly broadcast. I imagine he was to hear the King. But also, they'd never really heard a public address system before. Certainly a novelty. It was transmitted from London 2:00 station. It was simultaneously broadcast from there to 8 other stations, which was a fairly new BBC innovation at the time, rather than purely regional programming. No other monarch has at any time spoken to anything like such a number of hearers, and the thing was made possible simply and solely by the microphone and by the utilisation of wireless. Never before on the planet had there been a royal audience of millions. Chief Engineer Peter Eckersley afterwards said that they had telegrams literally from John O'Groats to Land's End reporting that the speeches and the entire ceremony were distinctly heard. There was even a radio listener in Poughkeepsie, New York, who said that he managed to hear it cross the Atlantic. To make it all possible, the King had several microphones. There were BBC Round Sykes microphones in front of him for broadcasting, 2 of them, leaving nothing to chance. There's another Gold Edge microphone above him connected to the Western Electric PA system, so that's a different mic to amplify him throughout the venue. And he was being separately recorded by the HMV Gramophone Company. More of that later. There's another microphone at the entrance of the Royal Tunnel, and there's another where Edward Elgar is conducting. To blend in, the King's microphones are delicately presented, each one on stage finished in gold, looked like a small box with a cloth over it. Someone said it looked like the King was talking to a small covered bird cage. And actually one of the microphones was then given to the Plymouth radio station afterwards for use in their studio. Don't know if they still have it. In his speech, the King talked of cooperation throughout the empire and a great future for Britain, and of course the great exhibition ahead of them, which would last a full year.
I declare the British Empire exhibition open, and I pray that by the blessing of God it may conduce to the unity and prosperity of all my people and to the peace and well-being of the world.
Once he'd finished, the crowd went wild. And then the Bishop of London.
Let us pray.
Oh, I feel like David Dimbleby introducing such dignitaries.
Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, thou great ruler of all the world.
Now, given the size of audience, this is the most heard prayer in the world up to that point. Never before have so many millions of people joined in one prayer.
On the eternal foundation of righteousness and love.
The Bishop of London gives the Lord's Prayer. Every word could be distinguished. That, of course, was because they were familiar, said one listener, who'd found it trickier to pick out every word of the speeches when they didn't know what was going to be said. But yeah, the Lord's Prayer, familiar to its listeners. So that was quite easily picked up. Then Jerusalem was sung by the choir, conducted by Elgar himself. A royal salute fired. The massed bands played Land of Hope and Glory and then Soul of the World. Don't know that one myself. And then the exhibition was opened. The broadcast ended. There were other communication stunts. The King sent a telegram that instantly travelled around the world in 1 minute and 20 seconds before being given back to the King by a messenger boy. This entire exhibition then was a year-long show-off of just how darn great Great Britain was, how United Kingdom was. The largest exhibition anywhere in the world. 27 million people showed up over the course of that year. I'm sure many of them were there because they'd heard that grand opening. And this Empire exhibition also put Wembley on the map. It was a temporary exhibition, but part of its construction was the permanent Wembley Stadium, then called the Empire Stadium. So without this exhibition, there's no Cathedral of Football, no three-syllable Wembley in the football chants. And to prepare for this big event, Wembley also built the world's first bus station. Yeah, before that, I guess, buses just meandered around from stop to stop. But enough of buses, we're talking about the BBC. So next day, His Majesty was presented with a special 2-valve wireless cabinet set designed by Chief Engineer Peter Eckersley. It had a loudspeaker and 4 headphones in a drawer. Very fancy. For a fuller description and a picture of the set, you can see our Facebook group where Andrew Barker, our newspaper detective, has uploaded newspaper cuttings of the day. The link to that is in the show notes. As for the rest of the day on the BBC, well, it was all themed on St George's Day and Shakespeare. Of course, it was his 360th birthday. At 10:35 in the evening, after God Save the King's speech was read out again, but this time in Esperanto. Apparently also, there was a repeat of the King delivering his speech, as Chief Engineer Peter Eckersley explained in one newspaper. A record of His Majesty's speech was made with our permission by His Master's Voice Gramophone Company from a loudspeaker at their works this morning. The King has graciously granted us permission to broadcast this record. It was represented to His Majesty that although millions heard the speech in the morning, there were vast numbers unable to listen in at that hour of the day. This record will be broadcast from all BBC stations soon after 10 o'clock this evening. Captain Eckersley explained that the gramophone record, whilst a very creditable one, was not exactly a faithful rendition of the King's voice because, of necessity, many processes of amplification had to be gone through to make the speech a permanent one on the record.
Chapter 3. The Recording.
So the BBC then was given an HMV gramophone recording so it could play the King's speech back as a repeat. But it seems they didn't keep that record after using it. Well, the King was presented with a gramophone record of his speech, we know that much, so maybe he was presented with the one the BBC used. I have no proof of that. All I know is the BBC had a recording, and then they didn't, and then the King did. So, you do the math. For many years then, this recording was not in the BBC archives. Decades, in fact. It came back to them via a bizarre means. From 1933 to 1974, the Beeb had a programme called Scrapbook. For different years, they would revisit. Scrapbook for 1924 then was broadcast with little differences each time in the years 1936, 1955 and 1958. In the 1936 version, Scrapbook's presenter and producer Leslie Baily would then tell the tale of 1924, including the tale of the Empire exhibition.
We had done a scrapbook of the Wembley year in which we said that there was no recording at all of the King opening that exhibition because recordings weren't done in those days.
So whatever gramophone record was made in 1924 was long gone. There was no concerted effort to save anything, you see, to begin with. The joy of broadcasting was live. You couldn't keep things anyway. There was no culture of it. The earliest BBC recordings were from 1932. Even then, just the odd speech. mostly royals, ministers and people opening things once again. But this gives Leslie Baily, the scrapbook producer, a problem. How do you tell the tale of 1924 with no audio of it? So they improvised. The 1924 exhibition, for example, had a giant racer roller coaster. So when they wanted to recreate it 12 years later, they actually made it sound like a roller coaster by rolling an office chair over a thunder sheet and mixing in the sound of an underground train. And thank you to Professor Kate Lacey for that detail from her marvellous thesis on the scrapbook programmes. Yes, I read theses for fun. I am that guy. 1955, another couple of decades go by. Leslie Baily, still making those scrapbook programmes, revisits Scrapbook for 1924, puts it out again, but differently. They interview guests who were there, recreate the odd thing like we do on this podcast, but again, there are no recordings of 1924. Baily then told listeners, I'm sorry, we don't have a recording of George V's great speech, the first time a monarch ever broadcast. If only we had such a recording. I'll let Leslie Baily tell the tale, as he did to Roy Plomley in 1964 on Desert Island Discs.
Leslie, it's thanks to you and Scrapbook that we now have a recording of King George V opening Wembley exhibition.
Well, I wouldn't say it's thanks to me, it's thanks to one of our listeners.
So that's Mrs. Dorothy Jones of Croydon.
And this lady said we were wrong because her husband was a technician who had himself privately recorded the king in his own back porch.
And elsewhere, I've seen it described not as her husband's porch, but his laboratory.
On his own machine. And so she had a record of the king, and she very kindly sent us a copy of this. And the next time we did a scrapbook of that year, we put that record in.
So after Mrs. Jones sent the BBC that metal disc, the BBC now did have a gramophone recording of George V once again. Phew. Don't throw anything else away.
I hope the BBC is keeping for posterity all the stuff you've dug up.
Oh yes, everything is kept.
Let's have record number 5.
Everything is kept. Yeah, right. So that's how and why that recording of George V in 1924 is the oldest BBC recording that there is, and the only one from the 1920s until the BBC got their Blattnerphone recording device. And that nearly makes George V's speech the oldest recording in the world of broadcast radio. But there is one that came a few months before it.
Lifted the nations of the world to the high levels of vision and achievement upon which to gain war for democracy and right.
Ex-US President Woodrow Wilson delivers an Armistice Day speech.
The stimulating memories of that happy time of triumph.
10th of November 1923, this is the earliest known recording of a radio broadcast.
Responsible part in the administration of peace, or the firm and permanent establishment of the results of the war.
If, by the way, you ever hear this one claiming to be from Pittsburgh's KDKA election night special on the 2nd November 1920, launching broadcast radio.
This is KDKA.
That's a later reconstruction.
Of the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company in East Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
This one is from the 1940s.
We shall now broadcast the election returns.
You can tell because it's clear. Another clue is that KDKA had a temporary call sign back in 1920 of 8ZZ.
We'd appreciate it if anyone hearing this broadcast would communicate with us.
For more on the history of the BBC archives and what was kept and what was not and how and why they started collecting their audio, see our History of the BBC Archives special with former BBC sound archivist Simon Rooks, who will return on this podcast very soon. I did slightly hint he might be back this week, but we spent so long talking about the King, I've not found enough room for Simon. Apologies about that. But we will have Simon Rooks back very soon.
Chapter 4, The Royals.
Before we go, though, I did promise you I would tell you how George V's speech as that first broadcast monarch, how that fits into radio royalty. Because other royals who weren't monarchs did beat George V to it. Who were they? Well, let's work backwards then from George V. Just under 1 year earlier, we featured her on the most recent episode of the podcast, Princess Alice, the Duchess of Athlone, the cousin of George V. She opened the BBC Women's Hour, gave the first talk there on adoption. That was the 2nd of May 1923. And 1 week before that, you had the wedding of Prince Albert, later George VI, and Lady Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, they got hitched, but they didn't get broadcast. Go back a few months before that, and just before the BBC launched, 7th of October 1922, the Prince of Wales, so that's the brother of George VI, the older brother, the future King Edward VIII, he broadcast a speech from St James's Palace, one of the first OBs really, to the Scouts of Great Britain. That afternoon he'd also used a brand new public address system, also Marconi made, at a huge scout rally at Alexandra Palace. Alexandra, named after Queen Alexandra, his own mum. But a lot of scouts couldn't make that scout rally, and broadcasting was just along. The BBC was about to launch, so that evening on October the 7th, 1922, the Prince of Wales broadcast from the palace and was heard from Cardiff to Wokingham to Scotland. Really the first proper royal broadcast. But we could also go back 2 years before that, and there is another little-known broadcast. July 1920, Queen Alexandra, again the namesake of Alexandra Palace, the mother of the Prince of Wales, well, she joins one of the early Chelmsford tests, broadcasts to Scandinavia. There's Lauritz Melchior, the Danish tenor, and Queen Alexandra, well, she's Danish herself. She's married to Edward VII, but like European royalty generally goes, she's from a different country. So she greets Scandinavia, broadcasting to them via radio. The first royal broadcaster, you could argue? I think I found an earlier one, 1919 or early 1920. Difficult to tell which. Not a British royal, but the Crown Prince Ismail of Johor in Malaysia. He broadcasts from Guildford to AZ, about 2 roads away from where I live. And he actually transmits to his brother, Prince Ahmed, who is in Ipswich. Both these princes are in Britain as students. And he says, "Hello, I'm Biffy, speaking from 2AZ. Other people are listening in, so other radio hams hear him and don't know he's a prince, first of all, and think he said that he's Beefy. Actually, he said he's Biffy, that's his nickname. Now, I don't know if this counts as broadcasting as such. It's transmitting via radio, and other people have heard it. It's certainly radio, and I would argue this is the first Asian, Muslim, and royal on radio anywhere in the world. So that's 1919, 1920. But can we go back even further than that? Well, 1906, Christmas Eve, is generally thought to be the world's first broadcast. Reginald Fessenden transmitting to ships off the coast of Massachusetts. But there's no such thing as a first where radio is concerned, is there? Go back just a few months before that, 11th of July, 1906. Arguably, it's a broadcast when Edward VII and Queen Alexandra, there she is once again in her younger years, they're in Newcastle on Tyne, and they go to a scientific laboratory for a demonstration of various cutting-edge technologies, and they hear a demo of the talking ark. This is such an unknown story, but I think it's a fascinating one. Professor William Thornton is the Professor of Electrical Engineering there at Armstrong College in Newcastle on Tyne, and a publication called The Sphere printed this in July 1906. Their Majesties had a curious experience at the Armstrong College, Newcastle on July the 11th, when they witnessed a series of scientific demonstrations conducted by Professor Thornton, including a singing and speaking electric ark. In a distant room, various sounds were emitted in front of a receiver. They were then transformed in the room where their Majesties were into electric light between 2 carbon poles, and the vibration of the light recreated the original sounds. Among these were the words, "We are the talking arks. We wish your Majesties long life and happiness." The light reproduced a song, a piccolo, and a violin solo. Now, none of the names of these compositions is known, but I would suggest it could be that these are the first pieces of music ever broadcast before an invited audience. And whistling, which specially amused their Majesties, who wore coloured glasses to shield their eyes from the glare of the light. There's a picture to go with this, which we'll put on our Facebook group and on Twitter. It's a bizarre tale. I don't fully understand the technology they used here, but it sounds like broadcasting to me. This talking ark thing, transmitting speech that's recognisable, and songs, and Edward VII and Queen Alexandra were there to witness it. Bizarre. Now, we could go back even further to Queen Victoria, who never broadcast. It hadn't been invented yet, nor did she listen to the radio. That hadn't been invented yet. But she did have an electrophone. More on that in a few episodes' time with Dr. Natasha Kitcher, the electrophone expert. It's a sort of broadcasting via landline, bringing theatrical plays and church services to your house, or palace in Queen Victoria's case. So in a nutshell, down the Radio Royal family tree from Queen Victoria to present day, it goes like this. Queen Victoria, 1837 to 1901, listened to the electrophone in the 1890s. Her son, Edward VII, 1901 to 1910, attended an early radio demonstration of the Talking Ark in 1906. His wife, Queen Alexandra, broadcast to Scandinavia in 1920, and she named Alexandra Palace. Their son, George V, 1910 to 1936, broadcast in 1924 to 10 million people, which is what this episode in theory is all about before we got a bit distracted. And then later, George V started those royal Christmas messages that we still enjoy today. His older son, the next king, Edward VIII, 1936 to 1936, abdicated, was a big fan of wireless, and he actually beat his dad to it. He broadcast to Scouts a month before the BBC began, and that definitely was a proper broadcast. Edward VIII's brother, the next king, George VI, 1936 to 1952, overcame his stammer to broadcast Christmas greetings and to send encouraging wartime messages. His daughter, Elizabeth II, 1952 to 2022, began televised Christmas messages, broke records with her televised coronation and her televised funeral, and her son, Charles III, 2022 to present day, has been on BBC One's The Repair Shop. God save the Beeb. Well, if you've been standing to attention all this time, your legs must be very tired. Apologies, it's been mostly me this time, but it's been quite a story to tell with lots of little details. Next time, before we return to our podcast timeline of May 1923, we'll loiter a couple of episodes in later years. The Cello and the Nightingale coming up in 2 episodes' time. But next time, speaking of off-air recordings, as we've had this episode, gladly preserved by Mrs. Dorothy Jones, next time we're going to meet Mr. F.O. Brown. He's a 1930s radio listener with an Echo radio recorder device. It's about the same time the BBC got their Blattnerphone, and Mr. Brown is recording things off the air, and next time we'll hear them. We'll meet his grandson, who retains these recordings via Greenbank Records, and we'll hear some of those clips recorded off the air. And as we'll note, interestingly, a good chunk of those clips are indeed of royals. He recorded George V, Edward the Prince of Wales, and King George VI. More preserving of old radio next time. Don't miss it. For now, thank you for listening. If you like the podcast, do please share and subscribe and rate and review and patronise us on Patreon for video extras and things. £5 a month, discount for royalty. I'm joking, it's double for you. And lastly, you can catch me on tour if you like, when we tell a more condensed story in an evening of very old radio. Visit paulcarenza.com/tour for dates and details. And I'll be doing a walking tour soon of early BBC venues in central London. Do email paul@paulcarenza.com if you're interested in joining us for that. Now, please be upstanding for our podcast's anthem. The British Broadcasting Century is a solo-operated podcast, not made by the BBC, but just run by little old Paul Carenza, with original music by Will Farmer. We try to only use clips that are out of copyright due to age. Bits that are the BBC's are used with kind permission. BBC copyright content reproduced courtesy of the British Broadcasting Corporation. All rights are reserved. Every single one. Thank you for joining us. I hope you've been informed, educated, and maybe even entertained. And join us next time for a few more off-air recordings from spring 1932. I've been Paul Carenza. God save the King. All of them. That one, and that one. And any queens. In fact, God save all of us, please. This is the British Broadcasting Century.